Good morning, good day, good afternoon, good evening. I think we have a truly kind of global panel here today and a global audience also. My name is Christine Eggeling. I'm very happy to be the moderator for this fantastic webinar here today, and I'm part of kind of the leadership group of the Diplomatic Studies section of the ISA. And the webinar today is part of a series of book talks that we've been hosting with the section, primarily in this webinar format. And today it's our distinct honor to have Dylan Loh with us for a presentation and a talk about his new book, China's Rising Foreign Ministry Practices and Representations of Assertive Diplomacy, which was published in 2024 by Stanford University Press. And Dylan Loh is assistant professor at the Public Policy and Global Affairs program at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. And Dylan's research interests include, of course, China's foreign policy, international diplomacy, and conceptualizations of international order. And then to talk about the book today, we have two stellar colleagues joining us. First, I would like to introduce Beverly Loh, a senior lecturer in the Department of International Relations at the Coral Bell School of Asia-Pacific Affairs at the Australian National University. And Beverly's research interests include the politics of great power responsibility, China's foreign policy, global knowledge production, and international relations of the Asia-Pacific. And then secondly, we have Deepak Nair, a sociologist of diplomacy and international bureaucracy with a regional interest in Southeast Asia. Deepak is currently a senior lecturer in the Department of International Relations, also at the Coral Bell School at the ANU. Before I give the floor to Dylan, who will share a couple of slides to present his book, and just a few more notes on housekeeping. As Kat said, we use the Q&A function in Zoom. So please, if you have any questions at any point throughout the talk, just put the questions there, and I will collect them and kind of bring them up in a second round of questions to Dylan. We only have 1 hour in total, so time is precious. But broadly, we'll go to Dylan, and then we'll have some comments and questions from our two discussants. Dylan, you will get a chance to respond, and then we will go back to our discussants and also take in questions from the audience. I'm really excited to hear the presentation of your book and also the discussion that will follow afterwards. So, Dylan, without much further ado, I give the microphone to you and invite you to share your slides.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you to everyone who is here at this very strange hour. It's 5 p.m. here, but I have to start off really with thanking Christine for organizing this. I really have to say a big thank you to Kat for staying up at 5 a.m. to help us with the IT, and of course to Deepak and Beverly for very kindly spending time reading through the book and also being here with us tonight. I will share my screen and try to, as rapidly as possible, go through some of the core arguments that I make. This is a hugely condensed version of my book talk. I usually spend about an hour going through, so I seek your indulgence if I jump a bit too quickly or speak a bit rapidly. I make 3 interventions. Actually, I make much more, but just for the purposes of the presentation today, 3 interventions that you see there. And the very first one that I would like to talk about is the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs and its diplomats' alleged weakness. So I do that by way of laying out some of the conventional wisdom that exists in the literature on the type, the character, the shape of China's diplomacy and Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And the very big first conventional wisdom that my book argues against is this idea that MFA is a weak institution. And I exemplify it by way of this comment by an interviewee. He said that, his diplomat said that in the past, no one cared about what a Chinese vice foreign minister said. Now, what a vice foreign minister says will move financial markets. And I think that this is quite remarkable on at least two levels. One is that this comment was said with quite a bit of confidence because it is grounded in some truth. It is not hyperbolic. It is not being disingenuous. The fact of the matter is what a vice foreign minister, which is not a very highly ranked bureaucrat in the Chinese system today, will be able to have an impact on financial markets around the world. So how has China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs seen their influence and status grow? There is this push to give the Ministry of Foreign Affairs greater resources, but also increasing professionalization. So for example, in 2018, the overall broad diplomatic budget doubled from 30 billion RMB to 60 billion RMB. This is quite expected as China grows, as it has more material resources at hand that is able to develop and devote greater resources to its diplomatic ecosystem, commensurate with its position as a great power. More significantly, I think, beyond the increase in diplomatic budget, which has ebbed and flowed historically, is that for the first time ever in 2019, China actually overtook the US with the largest number of global diplomatic presence, 276 diplomatic missions compared to 270 or something to that extent. But the first time ever overtaking the US, largest number of missions, embassies, consulates across the world. And that lead is sustained and it is continued to the present day. But actually, beyond the material argument, symbolism and personnel appointments are more important in the Chinese context. And here I point to Wang Yi's appointment to the state councillor positions in 2018. And back then, Yang Jiechi was still the director of the Office of the Foreign Affairs Commission, and Yang Jiechi's elevation to the Politburo. I had that in bold because this elevation to the Politburo was important because it restored a 10-year gap where the foreign minister was not present in the 25, it changes 24, 25, 25-man Politburo because the Politburo is the apex of political power. More significantly, there are 27 hierarchical layers in civil service in China. Only the first and second hierarchy in the 27 Politburo, in the 27 hierarchical system qualifies to be called a state leader. By virtue of being in the Politburo, you are called a deputy leader, which is 副国级. So only the first and second rank are allowed to be termed national leaders and allowed to be called national leaders in China. So being in the Politburo gives you that status as a legitimate state leader. In 2018, the leading small group on foreign affairs was upgraded to a commission. This is not simply just a redesignation because calling something or institution a commission actually endows it with greater prestige and gives you more resources. So calling the Foreign Affairs Commission, which sits above the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, is quite significant to move. What I also found was that the foreign minister and his diplomats are increasingly intervening on domestic issues in a way that they did not before. Happy to talk about this in the Q&A. Now, you might agree with my argument that say that, okay, they have seen their resources, they have seen their stature increase, but MFA simply implements. It doesn't decide on policy, and therefore it is toothless. But I think it's well established in the literature and international relations, and some of my colleagues here today also do a lot of good work here. Implementation is not neutral. It is not apolitical or simply a technical practice. I think this has been quite well established. But what is more, in the Chinese political system, if it's simply true that power is the ability to call on other people to do this and do that, everyone else other than Xi Jinping can be deemed powerless. But that is obviously not true. And I think that this statement by interviewee highlights this very clearly. This diplomat was telling me that they meaning the diplomats, they are not the decision makers. So there was a recognition that they are not the ones that decide on policy, but importantly, they make use of the process, they make use of the diplomatic ecosystem in China and use their own influence, of which they do have some influence, to influence the decision makers in an indirect way. So it's true that they do not directly decide, but they can make use of their significant influence to influence the decision makers. So what influence do they hold? So in my book, following on a lot of the work done already on power, international relations, I conceptualize power as capacities or capabilities. And I created a typology of the advising, coordinating, and implementing capacities. Now, This is by no means unique to China. I think foreign ministries of all stripes have various, and diplomats have various capacities like this as well. But the point I was trying to make here is even in the Chinese political system, where it seems that power, popularly known, is very direct, exercised in a naked way, very strong, but it's not really true that diplomats actually, through their functional capacities of advising, coordinating, implementing, have a suite of areas, surfaces where they can work on to exert influence in policymaking, in foreign policy. I will not go through all of them, but I will perhaps speak very briefly on coordinating capacities. So it's documented that in some instances in multilateral forum, particularly on China, ASEAN multilateral forum, there were episodes or examples where Chinese diplomats were asking for a change of hotel stays for their leaders, possibly without even the knowledge of their political leaders themselves at the very last minute. So of course, it's not a very nice thing to do. They were having these demands met, and they were able to, the hosts would be able to scramble and produce another suitable hotel venue for their political leaders to stay. Now, a small country such as where I'm from, Singapore, for example, and other small countries on 2 points, would not even think about doing that, probably will face greater pushback on something as banal as your hotel stays. And that is the point I'm trying to make. These banal exercises of getting and extracting concessions from the other, of making demands and having those demands met, are exercises in the production of state power, because they're able to do that and get away with doing that. They're able to essentially do what they want. I talk about advising and implementing as well, but I will not go in details with those two in the context of time. And I come to my final conventional wisdom, so to speak. China's foreign policy decision-making, or the ecosystem in which it exists, is exclusively held by one or two, or that one actor is the president himself. Because I think that's quite popular to buy into this idea of a powerful person sitting atop his seat, dictating state, dictating people and bureaucrats to his will, bending the state to his will, and every bureaucrat or official will listen and implement his wishes. But actually, there's a lot, I found there's a lot more ad hocism, a lot more patchwork, uncertainty, a lot more plodding along, a lot more emergence, a lot of responding to things as they happen, not necessarily in a strategic manner, not necessarily done strictly to the dictates of one person. And I rendered this first charting of the diplomatic field, where the ones that you see in darker blue is the one that's closest to the center of power in terms of foreign policy decision making. And herein is where a bit of Bourdieu comes in. Bourdieu talks about fields, and he talks about fields in very colorful manner. He has this very nice line I like, where he talks about fields as rooms. And if you're in one room and there's somebody in the other room, and they can struggle and kill each other in the other room, and you wouldn't know, because there are these fields where people struggle. His emphasis was on struggle. But what I found was that, yes, very clearly there are struggles in the field, but actually, you know what? Actors in the field also cooperate very often. And I pointed out the various ways in which different actors in the diplomatic field in China cooperate frequently, even as they compete. And what makes them hang together? I pointed out that there are twin processes at play: selection and socialization, plus restriction and fealty displays, which I will talk about in a bit. Just a quick note on the acronyms. PSC is Politburo Standing Committee. CCP Liaison Department is the party wing of the, separate from Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but it engages in party-to-party diplomacy. So the implication here is that there's a greater emphasis on discipline, on loyalty, and ideological fidelity. A couple of interview comments. In typical foreign ministry, going to have overseas experience, studying in prestigious institutions in UK, US is generally seen as a net positive. In the Chinese system, not so, it's mixed. In fact, it is seen by some as a negative mark even, because you've spent time at these Western countries, in these Western universities, you are more susceptible to ideological influences. It might invite questions about your ideological loyalty. I think together with Xi's anti-corruption campaign, I think this spills over into the displays of luxuries and goods. And I had that line here about how this interviewer was telling me that they do not, or they dare not even display liquor. Moutai is a very famous Chinese liquor, and they serve water as well. Only water, because if you have conspicuous displays of goods or luxury that might be construed in a particular way, you could invite questions on your ideological fidelity. So I mentioned what makes the field hang together is political loyalty, and this is seen by way of greater fealty pledges to President Xi, Secretary General Xi. So in my interviews, I saw a quite a clear step up when they were asked questions, and they frequently invoked the president and frequently paid deference to the president in saying that he said this, he said that, and so on and so forth. And I think that was quite consequential. I will very quickly point out that there exists a party cell in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. For the first time in 2009, Qi was appointed the party secretary of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and unlike previous party secretaries, who were all career diplomats, Qi is through and through a party member. I can talk about some of the implications. I would like to point to the last two lines here. In 2009, a law on diplomat was introduced, and it switched. The original wording was the diplomats' rights and obligation. Rights, that means the institution's rights to me, my human rights and obligation. It switched the wording around to obligations first and rights. Now, it's not just a semantic switch. I think it's more than a symbolic switch, because it has very strong consequences, because now then it is your obligation and duty to the institution that takes precedence over your rights as a worker. I think third section of Article 8 points this out very clearly. It disallows the resignation of diplomats stationed abroad. I'm reaching the end. In fact, this is my last slide. So what are some of the implications for China's IR? Chinese state power is much more complex and diffuse than what is sometimes popularly assumed. China's rise is not simply military economic rise, it is also a diplomatic rise. And the story of China's diplomatic rise is often missed. Finally, I'd like to just point out that when we study international relations and we look at some of these traditional phenomenon, power, war, peace, and so on and so forth, oftentimes, especially in the context of China, Ministry of Foreign Affairs is often absent or thought of as epiphenomenon or a byproduct of something else. But as my book hopes to show, that there's a lot of mileage to be had, a lot of profit to be taken by studying diplomats, diplomacy, and ministries of foreign affairs. Come to the end of my very rapid 10-minute introduction, and I very much look forward to my fellow panelists' questions and to the audience comments and questions as well. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Dylan, for compressing so many things. That was really excellent. Beverly, I think we will start with you. Please go ahead.
Well, thanks very much to Kristen, to Kat, and to the ISA team for organizing this event. I'm really happy to be here to virtually celebrate and discuss Dylan's new book. Dylan, many congratulations. It's an absolute pleasure to read this book, beautifully written. As you sort of highlighted as well, you persuasively argue against these sorts of analyses that present Chinese MFA as weak, fragmented, and a diplomatic lightweight in international affairs, showing instead the MFA's expanded profile and representational role, and how Chinese diplomatic practices are essentially a really important variable in explaining increased Chinese assertiveness. I think for me, the book really demonstrates a very masterful intertwining of the theoretical and the empirical, where you engage with practice theory to really examine the micro processes, right, of actors, materials, lived experiences, and everyday realities, and really backed up by some really marvelous quotes from your interviewees. So really well done on a very valuable contribution to our understanding of China's foreign ministry and also rising Chinese assertiveness. One particular fascinating theme for me, and I think one of the really great strengths of the book, is how you threaded across the various chapters this notion of socialization and conformity, you know, into ways of doing, ways of saying and performing. And to be sure, this sort of routinized practice is not unique to China. civil servants, diplomats, politicians all around the world are molded and arguably socialized into a very particular role from very early on. But I was struck by how perhaps in the Chinese context, it is perhaps even more rigid, right? And some of the examples that you gave, for instance, in chapter 3, how this Ministry of Foreign Affairs affiliated universities really supply the bulk, right, of foreign ministry recruits, and the challenges, right, of trying to diversify outside of non-MFA affiliated universities, all the way through in chapter 4, the discipline that you talk about that is expected of Chinese foreign ministry officials, the types of restrictions of movements and on interpersonal relations. And as you just mentioned, that sort of almost tribute giving and deference and praise and alignment with Xi Jinping and his thought. And so for me, what was really interesting was this perpetuation of a particular kind of knowledge production, reproduction, and also dissemination, right? So this very particular socializing and conforming processes and practice that are at play here. So much so that what a Chinese diplomat is expected to say and do and perform becomes, common sense knowledge. It becomes habitus. And there's a really good quote that you have here on page 111, where you say, and I quote, "While individuals are never completely without agency, mutual surveillance, legislative restrictions, requirements for political discipline, and selective hiring indicate a higher degree of conformity across diplomats. This suggests that the institutional habitus has a greater influence over the inhabitants' habitus rather than the reverse." And so when I was reading this, I was really struck by this sense of orchestration, right? And I guess I wondered, and this is my initial two-part question to you. Firstly, how much space is there for officials, MFA officials and diplomats to go off script beyond the official line, right? What happens if there is a deviation from the norm, right? What kinds of disciplining mechanisms exist? There are parts of the book that I think hint at this, right? You talk about at the institutional level, there are certain strategies that the official can take to mitigate the conflict between their individual and the organizational sort of worldview. And then at the organizational level, you refer to this notion of institutional plasticity. So I was hoping if you could expand a little bit more on this disciplining and deviation bit. The second one that I'll articulate here is on learning. What types of learning processes and practices are going on here? And I think particularly in the context of when there is an assertive sort of gesture and behavior that brings on significant reputational costs and international backlash. I'm thinking, for instance, in the context of wolf warrior diplomacy, or when there is pushback, right? I think one of your cases on the South China Sea, when there is pushback against Chinese assertiveness from countries like Singapore, like Indonesia, and regional organizations like ASEAN. What types of learning takes place? Is it simply directed from above? In your sort of diagram, is it simply a directive from Xi Jinping and the Politburo Standing Committee? What is the tipping point, right? When there is an action and a reaction that then leads the Chinese foreign ministry or Xi Jinping to sort of go, hang on, maybe we need to adjust our practices. So I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Many thanks to Beverly. And Dylan, I think we'll invite Deepak to comment, and then you can respond collectively if that's okay with you. Thank you. Yep. Deepak, please.
Excellent. Please let me know if you can't hear me clearly. I presume you can. Dylan, congratulations. What a terrific achievement. Well, I hope you're enjoying the experience, and I hope it's been wonderful as it should be. It's a great book. And thank you, Kristen, for organizing this. What a terrific chance to actually read the whole book and actually to use this opportunity to continue the conversation, to ask all kinds of questions that emerge from the cumulative experience of reading the book. Let me just say that as someone who has I mean, in part, who works on international political sociology, practice theory, this book obviously was immediately resonant. And I've written elsewhere, as Dylan knows, in an ISQ piece on where, in fact, I interrogate a particular point of a particular theoretical point Dylan makes, and the point being that this is exactly the sort of exacting, rich, ambitious work that practice theory needs. Not just because of sort of the low-hanging fruit argument that this is extending it to a non-European, non-Western canvas. Of course it is, but more than that, Dylan uses this book to actually engage in conceptual innovation. He scales up habitus to an organizational scale, which many scholars, in fact, in practice theory don't do. We are very much wedded to a much more individual, embodied sort of referent. And also other concepts which he advances. I thought the concept of what was it? Let me catch it again. Where basically it's sort of a middle ground between through which the field gets not disrupted but misaligned and produces particular kinds of effects. I think the concept here was transversal disruption. I really liked it. I have a few questions and quibbles about how fields get used, how habitus gets used, of course. And those are conversations Dylan and I have been having, and it's been great fun and very enriching. But the point being that the central claim that Dylan makes through this book is, as has been very clearly outlined by him in the presentation, and Beverly also sort of touched on, which was this point about the role and position of the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And so as someone who has an ear on the contours of the Asian security studies discourse, I've been very familiar with this point that the Chinese Foreign Ministry is really not a player. It's the People's Liberation Army, the Navy, the Communist, the Politburo, what have you. And so I must confess, when I started reading this book, I did share a certain degree of skepticism. But once I started reading the book and I started seeing the evidence that Dylan presents, I did come out fairly convinced that there is a very interesting, nuanced argument here. And my summary of the argument really is that what we see here is that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs draws its influence from leveraging on what we may call the interaction rituals of diplomacy, from using and managing the ritual staging of visits, the timing of visits, scheduling protocols, the use of body, gesture, paralanguage, tone, through which, in fact, diplomacy and states and state relations are produced and performed. And it's precisely through that production and performance that all kinds of meanings are conveyed and produced, in this case, the assertiveness, the notion and idea, indeed the representation of China as being assertive and what have you. And this is the capacity that the MFA leverages on, and in doing so, it has actually been quite consequential. So yes, that is a really interesting argument that is very faithful to the kind of ambition that practice theory and international political sociology has been trying to advance. So that is great. Well done, Dylan. Just a few questions to take away from the book, and Kristen, please let me know if I'm going over my time, in which case I can actually bracket a question for later. The first question I have is, and I realize that Dylan does make this very clear that he's interested in offering a synchronic snapshot of this story. And he's very explicit about it. But I was wondering, and I suppose my questions really, Dylan, are for you as someone who is sitting on a fantastic achievement and is, and is stewing in this project, perhaps also keen to get away from it. But I'm interested in asking questions in terms of questions that emerge from the book. As I said, a longer runway, in terms of your thinking on this topic more broadly. So the first is, is there in fact a case to be made for actually writing a bigger story of where you're able to embed this particular account in a more diachronic account of these practices? The reason I say this is because obviously the MFA is a product of its history, as you say, and you very compellingly make the case for that. And one would hypothesize that therefore there are a repertoire of practices from the past which inform practices of today. And it occurred to me that you're very nicely telling us of a certain shift from the Hu Jintao period to the Xi Jinping period. And this is a period of authoritarian tightening. And also, one could make the case for this radicalization of the MFA and the diplomats. And straight away, what came to my mind was we have precedents for this in China's 20th century history. We think of the Cultural Revolution, which directly had a bearing on, in fact, its diplomats were the ones who kind of spooked the Vietnamese during the Cultural Revolution into going closer to the Soviets. So again, I was wondering, like, is there therefore a repertoire of practices which are in play here that draw on that history, on China's own diplomatic history and practices, which become important? And also, I think there is this element of language. You know, when I was reading your quotes, and again, very nicely sort of illuminated these points on Wolf Warrior diplomacy and the language that gets used and the tone and paralanguage that's in play. I was struck again by the sort of this particular jarring, stilted, abrasive quality of official rhetoric, which, if you go back to the Cold War years, it's like the lackeys of the West, imperial lapdogs. There's something very, there's nothing, there's no way in which it's trying to sort of charm you into its discourse and propaganda. It is very hard. And there's a bit of that we come across here too. And I was wondering, is there again, like, is there a precedent which almost sort of captures an attempt to offer a counter to Western discourses on all kinds of things, which gets caught up in this language which emerges from that past itself, you know? So anyway, that was one point on the value of actually a diachronic analysis of these very practices of assertive diplomacy in China's diplomatic history. The second is, as a sociologist, when I was reading this, I was wondering, is there a class story here? Is there a gender story here? Is there a race story here? And yes, there are occasional moments where we find bits here and there, but I was wondering, again, looking back at your project, could there have been a more systematic treatment of this? And I say this like very sympathetically because when I wrote when I'm working on my manuscript, and I wrote like almost at the end of it, I have come to realize that, my God, I have not actually paid enough attention to gender. And I could actually rewrite so much if I think of this in a slightly different way. I'm just wondering what happens to those aspects, which are obviously perhaps part of the sociological imagination that you're trying to bring to play when you're studying practice as well. And the reason I mentioned race is because foreign policy, you know, representational work, discursive work unfolds in a very racialized space. And so clearly the Chinese diplomats responding to the West, to the Europeans, to the Americans in the context of COVID, or even before that, in terms of civilizational discourses, surely there's a racial subtext to these things. How does one actually study that? And actually beyond the substantive point, and this is the point which I think makes your work so important for practice theory, is the methodological one, and which does not get touched upon in the book, which is your fieldwork was, in my sense, reading of this, surely freighted by your own identity as a Singaporean Chinese, which mediated the kind of relationships you could strike with your interlocutors in the mainland. And so race is very much part of the data generation process, I'd imagine. When I met Chinese diplomats once, I remember they, for the longest time, cajoled me because they thought I was Singaporean. Because I was from NUS and because I was they thought I was an ethnic Indian, right? So their treatment towards me was completely different once they found out that I was actually from India. So race, coded / ethnicity, nationality has particular effects, and I would imagine this is part of the story. Okay, last final point here. I think I'm getting over time. Should I return to this later, or should I?
Please go ahead, Deepak.
Very quickly, we end up with a slightly bleak story here. And I was left wondering what is left here in terms of the possibility of Chinese cosmopolitanism, the account of Chinese MFA's cosmopolitanism, because we're dealing with diplomats. Diplomats by profession are known to be worldly, they're exposed. And in fact, the perennial risk about diplomats is that is the risk of localitis, going native. And you make a very interesting case as to how they are being disciplined and policed and constrained. But then again, many of them are from language, their degrees they're from language schools. And yes, they're not getting cosmopolitan Western education, but then I wonder what is left of this, of the notion that there could be a certain cosmopolitanism to these diplomats, even in the Xi Jinping era. What are the possibilities? I mean, they, having studied Spanish or Portuguese or Japanese, surely they read Japanese novels, they eat Japanese cuisine. What happens to that worldliness what is left of it? Is there some way to recover and study that? And of course, that requires different methodological tools. I'm thinking of Susan Bailey and her work on Asian voices in a post-colonial age and what have you. She studies sort of Vietnamese and Indian journalists and the socialist ecumene, the afterlives of Cold War cosmopolitanism among the socialists. So yeah, stuff like that. What's left of, is any possibility of that being there, Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dylan, we'll give you an opportunity to respond, and then we'll open up for a second round of questions. So both Beverly and Deepak, the things you couldn't say now, you'll get another chance, obviously, to engage. And then I just want to remind all of the attendees, if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the Q&A. But Dylan, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Beverly. Thank you for Deepak. Both of you really owe a lot of gratitude to you for engaging with the text and the book in a deep way, and for the very tough, but I think very productive questions as well. Thank you, of course, for the very kind words you have for the book. And both of you are my very good friends as well, and you know that I do use your work, and I follow both of your work very closely, including Christina as well. That you guys, your works were used in my book and continue to be used. So thank you very much for your kind words. Beverly, you had two questions there that I want to respond to, and I think that they are very apt questions as well. They are questions that I could not answer properly in the book, because these are questions that I thought about as well that emerged really after the publications of the book. One on spaces and opportunities for MFA officials to go off script. It's strange and almost there's a contradictory movement, as is always the case in the Chinese system. So the space for diplomats to go off the script from state narrative is very low, simply because of the diplomatic disciplining mechanisms that I mentioned, because there were formal changes to the institution itself. I mentioned about the party cell that is in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Qi Yu, in 2019. He's not a diplomat, which means that the ministry itself has to spend some time every other week on party building work, on learning party ideology. In the past, when the party secretary was helmed by someone who is also a diplomat, he got it. He knew that these sorts of things, okay, we need to do this party work, but we are fighting fires here. We need to do our work as diplomats. There are pressing issues around the world. There's policy papers to write, and so on and so forth. But this was a party guy that came in that did not have the sensibilities of a typical Chinese diplomat. And so the demand for party building work was quite strongly felt. So that's one thing. So the space have actually, to deviate away from party ideology, national narratives have actually tightened up a bit. But ironically, because of Xi Jinping's call to tell China's story well, a separate sort of almost contradictory trend has also emerged, where you have this broad clarion call to fight for China, to tell China's story well, make sure you protect the dignity of the motherland, without a lot of specifics. So in this zeal to tell China's story well, you do have some space for diplomats to go off script in a way, or enjoy the freedom in a way that traditionally diplomats did not have. They did not have the call to, for example, insult the prime minister or president of another country. They did not have the leeway to go on Twitter and engage in insults with Twitter users and directly insult or display assertiveness in a way that was not open before to previous diplomats. So my answer to you is that there's both. Straying away from party narratives, much tightened. But on the other hand, you have this broad call to tell China's story well that created a situation where Chinese diplomats were doing very undiplomatic things. And I feel that they have taken it a bit too far. So this is my way of answering your second question as well. Is there learning? Yes, there is. I think sometimes we do not give the Chinese Communist Party and all of the institutions within a lot of credit because they have shown time and again that they're much more resilient than what people think. They have also shown time and again they are very capable of adapting and learning. So they may be slow to learn, for example, the reputational costs involved in wolf warrior diplomacy. But at some point, as you mentioned, tipping point, at some point, they realize the limits of coercive diplomacy. They realize the limits of wolf warrior diplomacy. And that's why today, in today's diplomats, you do not see the kinds of wolf warrior diplomacy or behavior that was present just a couple of years ago. You see the kind of diplomatic overtures that have been extended to Australia, to New Zealand, to even Europe as well, because I think that there is a bit of learning from what happened before internally. I think there's another layer of mutual learning as well. I think other diplomats, other countries, other regime types that are closer to China, they see the sort of domestic messaging and foreign policy messaging and benefits that could be had with a more wolf warrior-like diplomacy. So I believe there's some sort of mutual learning taking place as well. How and in what shape, in what ways, I do not know because I have not yet done a study on that. But I do believe there's a bit of an international mutual learning that is taking place. Deepak, thank you very much for your very apt comments on your question on whether this can be a bit more diachronic. Absolutely, I think so. I think so. Are you right in saying that this book could have been a bit more ambitious than what it was? I do think there is a scope for that. Is there a possibility for writing something more, situating the book more, or the claims that I make more in greater historical depth and greater historical context? Absolutely. It is something that I think I have been thinking about because you quite rightly pointed out, even in some of the contemporary stuff, contemporary practices that I identified, it has a historical referent point. These practices, these repertoires didn't emerge in a vacuum. There was some historicity to some of these practices that we see today. And if I may, then I'll point out to a couple of trends that affect the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that you spoke about, but is also quite pervasive in just simply in the entire political system. A couple of trends, which is formalism and bureaucratism. They are quite technical words in the context of Chinese policy making. Formalism, it means an adherence to protocols and a particular way of creating policy in a very formal way, in a way that from an outside eye, it can simply be seen as political or bureaucratic dysfunction. But to the Chinese system, actually, it is fundamental as a stitch in making the institution itself work. It strangely, even though it's problematic, it thrives on bureaucratism, it thrives on formalism, it thrives on a lot of these policy documents saying very general things, sometimes lacking in specific, but it works, and it is what has been a common thread, I think, since the founding of modern PRC in 49 up until the present day. But this trend is field pervasive, not just within the local diplomatic space. And that's why you hear things like imperial lapdogs, lackeys, not only with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but with the Ministry of Commerce, with the Ministry of Defense. It is something that is shared throughout the government ministries, and everybody knows it, that these are the language, these are the words, the playbook that they refer to, because there was this history back then. And that's why the official rhetoric sounds pretty similar as well. And also, to get back to Beverly's original question, they are learning from each other, these institutions at the Chinese political apparatus and different agencies. Setting up of Twitter accounts, for example, they learned from each other. Having spokesperson, Ministry of National Defense, actively learned from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Was there space to talk more about class, gender, ethnicity? Absolutely, I think so. And you're quite right to point out that there is an opportunity to talk about it in a way that I did not in the book. And to be honest, it also came after the fact that, oh yeah, I could have spoken more, or I could have done something more to push the question on gender, on ethnicity a bit more. It is quite clear that in terms of Chinese politics, there are very little female political holders. In fact, in the Politburo Standing Committee, the seven-member Politburo Committee, there's no females. In the Politburo itself, the 24-member Politburo, right below the 7-member Politburo Standing Committee, very few females as well. And that is pervasive throughout the political system in China. The gender balance in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is actually slightly more even. Why and how gender affects diplomacy? There's been no foreign minister who is of female gender, for example, is something that I do not consider, and is something that I honestly have not thought about in a much deeper way than I should. There is a very pervasive, and this has been well studied, of Han chauvinism in Chinese politics as well, where people who occupy the top positions across all institutions in the Chinese political ecosystem are not only male, but are Han Chinese. Is there scope for me to think about these questions much more deeply? I think so. And you are also quite right. My own identity as a Singaporean Chinese helps, and I have a very funny anecdote to share. So when I was doing field work, me and my PhD colleague approached the same diplomat. He is a German with a very German-sounding name. Me with an ambiguous, you wouldn't know, you would have guessed that I was probably Chinese. The diplomat only responded to me, not to my German colleague. And the conclusion that I came up with is, of course, I strategically play off my ethnicity as a Chinese, overseas Chinese. Even in my language, in my conversations, I strategically and deliberately sometimes resort to speaking Chinese, even though I'll be quick to add that once they knew I was Singaporeans, they wanted to speak in English. They wanted to speak in English for reasons that I find quite intriguing, because they wanted to demonstrate that they are as cosmopolitan as I am, and they can make use of the English language and answer all of these deep political questions in a way that they could with Chinese as well. Is there a possibility of Chinese cosmopolitanism showing up more? I will say that there was a period of time in Chinese history, modern history, that these Chinese cosmopolitans shone through a lot more strongly in the pre-Xi period. But right now, at the moment, it is not so. And herein, I will also point out that there was a point in the initial stages of China's MFA, most of the diplomats, especially the ambassadorial level, that the Chinese state drew upon were not professional diplomats. They were generals in the PLA, coming from a completely different worldview with completely different sensibilities. And there are several autobiographies that I read about this, because their worldviews, they have actually fought in wars as well. They just felt out of sync with diplomacy. They didn't know how to do diplomacy, so to speak, and it created a lot of strange situations because they didn't understand the language of diplomacy. So there was that period, and then a very steep learning curve. I will say that there are a lot of cosmopolitan people in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that I spoke to, but all of these have been suppressed because the byword now is national security. And I will point out again that national security and party ideology is pervasive, exerting its influence throughout the state beyond just the diplomatic field. And at the moment, there is, in my view, very little possibility for that sort of cosmopolitanism to rear its head. Thank you.
Thank you to Dylan. We'll open up for a second round of follow-up questions, follow-up comments from Beverly and Deepak. We'll go in that order again, and then I will add the questions that have come in the chat as well. So thank you, Beverly.
Great. Thanks, Dylan. I do have another round of questions. Maybe I'll just choose two, maybe. I guess the first one is on variation. You talk about how with practices, there is an audience, right? That is needed to receive, to evaluate these particular practices. And you make distinctions between the domestic and international audiences, right? And when I always often think about, for instance, Yang Jiechi's statement at the Alaska summit, where he sort of chided US diplomats. He went very against the kind of like what is expected of diplomatic symmetry. And he said, that, and I'm paraphrasing here, that the US doesn't have the capacity to speak to China from a position of strength, right? And this was seen as sort of, like another instance of wolf warrior, Chinese assertiveness on the international stage, but domestically sort of very well received, right? Of sort of this is a China that is pushing back against what is perceived to be unfair Western or US sort of criticism. But I just wondered whether there is variation within international audiences, right? So you make the distinction between domestic and international audiences. My question is more about looking at international audiences, and are there variations within and across this bunch of international audiences? So you write, for instance, that practices are essentially performative, right? And the larger the audience, I'm quoting here on page 51, the more vivid the performance needs to be. And China is arguably much more than before performing, right, to a much more global audience. And so I just wonder, are there certain international audiences that are more receptive to what China is doing in terms of these particular diplomatic practices? Is it translating to influence in certain audiences? And I guess a little bit to what Deepak was mentioning about that racial subtext, right? Does race come into play, right, in terms of how it's translating to particular audiences that share particular synergies with China, whether it is ideological or racial? And then the second question, a little bit more, I guess, policy, maybe thinking about policy implications or what this means for what the Chinese Foreign Ministry can play in the future. I was just struck reading again the State of Southeast Asia survey, right, that was published just last week by the IC's Yusof Ishak Institute. Nothing really very new in terms of China is still by far, right, the most influential economic, political, and strategic power in Southeast Asia, the region that you focus on in your book. Although there are some sort of reduced numbers in terms of the percentages here. But even though it is the most influential power as seen by Southeast Asians, it is also the most distrusted. And so I guess my question to you is, what role do you see the Chinese Foreign Ministry playing in trying to address this particular disconnect? Thanks.
Thank you. And Deepak, please.
No, I think I took enough time in the first round, so I'm happy to yield to you and to the audience.
Thank you. Dylan, we have two very good, great questions in the Q&A here. I'm just gonna briefly summarize them. So from the first question is from Astrid, who's asking, I was wondering how your book has been received in China, both by diplomats and IR scholars, which I think is a very interesting question. I'm also curious. And then there's a question from Sophie, who's asking about the date, range, and location of the interviews and the findings regarding the closer relationship between foreign and domestic policy. So some bigger questions from the audience and also from Beverly and from Deepak before. I would say we extend the webinar with a couple of minutes, so please feel free to respond to these points. Thank you.
Thank you. I will answer the two audience members' questions first because they are related, something to do with methodology. On Sophie's question, thank you for your question. I went to China to do field work in 2016, 2017, 2018. That's where my bulk of the field work was done in Beijing, and I went to Shanghai as well. I interviewed Chinese diplomats. I interviewed non-Chinese diplomats in Beijing. I spoke to former diplomats, and I spoke to people from government as well. The time frame that I was studying was from 2009 to 2020. Why 2009? Because 2009 was one of like the benchmark dates in Chinese foreign policy, because it's the year that most people mark as seeing a greater assertive turn in Chinese foreign policy, and that's why it made it a natural start for the study. The closer relationship between foreign and domestic policy, I think that the MFA underlines that quite closely. Why do I say so? Almost happening in the reverse, because you do see the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and its official talking about domestic policy in a way that previously they did not really talk about. In fact, at the Liang Hui, that was the 2 sessions. These are important annual political events in China. If you watch the press conference of the foreign minister, he was intervening on a slew of domestic policies or very specific stuff on domestic policies as well. To me, this indicates, as you pointed out, the greater imbrication of domestic policies and foreign policies, but also that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs itself is willing and confident to speak authoritatively on stuff that you traditionally would not associate with the foreign ministry, at least in the context of China. Astrid, thank you for your question. I do have a sense on how my book has been received. After my field work, I did not go to China because of COVID and because I came back to Singapore and work got in the way. Then I went back. Last year, I went to China twice, and I speak to Chinese scholars that have heard of my book and have read my book. I can say that it is well received, at least anecdotally, from some of these scholars that have spoken to me. And they say that I'm glad that you wrote this book, because they were quite clear that what was unspoken is they were not able to write something like that, even though they would possibly have access to greater information than I had. Also, interesting story. A couple of weeks ago, I read a friend from China sent me a link. So in China, there's this very famous social media app called Xiaohongshu. It's called Red Note. That's when the TikTok ban, and a lot of people migrated to Xiaohongshu in the US. So there was this app called Xiaohongshu. And somebody sent me a link from China and said, hey, look, you are going viral. So there was this account in Xiaohongshu that featured new books. And my book was featured, and there were a lot of comments, and it had like several hundred likes, several thousand likes, and several hundred comments. And interestingly, the comments were not completely negative. When I was really like, oh no, am I in trouble? Can I go to China from now on? Is this going to get... But no, actually, there was a lot more curiosity, a lot of curiosity that, oh, I didn't know that XYZ happened. I would be interested to find out more. Is there a Chinese version of the book? Where can I buy this book? And so on and so forth. It was actually quite a refreshing surprise when I brought myself to actually read through the comments. It was more of curiosity. It was more of interest in the book. So this tells me that actually at the average Joe's level, there is this openness actually to stuff, to knowledge. Beverly, you talked about knowledge production earlier. That is not necessarily state sanctioned. There is still this curiosity. There's still this demand for this sort of work. Is it challenging to do research on China in the way that I did? Absolutely. I can tell you for sure, I would not be able to get access or speak to the people that I spoke to today compared to where it was. In fact, some of my contacts don't speak to me anymore, even though I want to try. And I can understand that, of course, out of their own self-interest. Why would they want to risk whatever their careers and whatnot to speak to this scholar? It is far more challenging. Foreign Ministry Archives was open at some point in time, but it has closed completely. There's no way to go into the foreign policy archives. Now more than ever, you require the help of other actors in the diplomatic landscape. Your non-Chinese diplomats in Beijing. You need to speak to people working in media in China who are still willing to speak to you. You need to speak to party officials if they are still willing to speak to you. So the kind of very ethnographically sensitive work that has been done before, and by no means I'm the only one that do it. There are other scholars and recent books that came out in the recent past that also did that. Very difficult to replicate. Beverly, variations in audience. Thank you for the fascinating question. To be really honest, I have not thought about that. And in some ways, I think you're absolutely right that this binary of just foreign audience, domestic audience is a bit too neat and perhaps a bit too naive, and that I didn't think it through in greater variation as well. But you're quite right. You're quite right. And I do actually see some variation in their messaging. What and how they speak to people in Southeast Asia and in ASEAN, very different from how the diplomats and in their diplomatic messaging in Europe, in Central Asia, in the US. I will say that they have spent a bit more time, and I didn't have time to cover this in my book, they have spent a bit more time courting the global south. Of course, I don't like the term. I think it's problematic, this term global south. But I would say that they have found quite a bit of success with the global south, partly because the regime types of the global south are quite varied. And there's quite a bit of more authoritarian, illiberal democracies than not, in broadly speaking, the global south, that find affiliation to the messages that China has put out. Let me give a quick example. So they recently introduced the 3 global initiatives: global security initiatives, global development initiatives, global civilizational initiatives. And I think that what they did was quite glib. So in one of these initiatives, they sort of recast this idea of rights, of human rights, and they pointed out quite clearly, not without any reason as well, that, hey, rights, the individual rights, is about my right to walk home safely at night in the streets, my right to education, my rights to get lifted out of poverty. And obviously, this is in contrast to the abstract sort of human rights that the West generally speaks of: the right to participate in elections, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and so on and so forth. And I will say that these sorts of discourse and messages do find traction, broadly speaking, in the global south. You pointed out about the latest Yusof Ishak survey. This is an elite survey done in Southeast Asia. And indeed, the latest survey showed that trust in China has sort of like slipped, and more people trust the US than China now, just a small percentage. What's the role of MFA? I think, as I mentioned, I alluded to earlier, that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is very adept at learning. It may take some time, but they are learning. They are actively trying to digest the information, and I think they see the limits of wolf warrior diplomacy. They see the limits of coercive diplomacy. Now, I don't think they will abandon wolf warrior diplomacy or the broader clarion call to fight and to tell China's story well, but I think that they will try to do it with a bit more finesse. So perhaps you may see references to imperial lapdogs maybe 5 times compared to 10 times before, but it won't go away. The wording is still there, but they are just scaling down. They are just using it with a bit more finesse. Challenges. Okay, I think that are the 2 questions, Beverly. But that's my response.
Thank you so much, Dylan, and thank you also to Beverly and Deepak and the audience for asking these great questions. Dylan, I think you said it best to describe how your book was received on this forum. There was a lot of curiosity, and I think there's a lot of curiosity also from us, and I'm sure from the audience, to actually go out and read the book. So one more time, the book we're talking about is Dylan's new book called China's Rising Foreign Ministry, Practices and Representations of Assertive Diplomacy. So do go out and get this wonderful book. I just want to thank you all for being here this morning, this evening, this afternoon, really across the world. Just a quick reminder to everybody listening is that the members of the Diplomatic Studies section have the right to initiate a suggestion for an event. So please, if you have, for example, a book you would like to add to this book talk series, do reach out to me or another member of the section leadership. I think Dylan also wants to say something.
Very quickly, Kat, before you close this, I just want to say I'm very, very grateful to Christine, very, very grateful to Kat and to Beverly and to Deepak for spending time here. And I truly enjoyed this session. Thank you all, and to the audience members as well.
Good to see you guys.
Bye.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Christine.
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
Deepak.